Good afternoon, and welcome to the first event of the Distinguished Speakers in International Business Series of 2021. Please note that this event is being recorded. My name is Marina Augustinus. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Global Business. The Center is the hub and driver of global education and activity at the Smith School. The mission of the Center is to connect the diverse members of the Smith School community to the world and the world to the Smith School community, to provide these members and partners with opportunities to gain a global mindset and build international business skills, and to serve as a Maryland resource center for companies seeking to take their goods into the global marketplace. The center is also home to one of 15 nationally recognized centers across the country to have been awarded a Title VI grant known as SIBE or Cyber. The SIBE grant is administered by the U.S. Department of Education and supports many of our activities, including this event today, and expands our mission outside the campus to industry and other academic institutions. The Distinguished Speaker Series brings together policymakers, industry leaders, academia, and students to discuss emerging trends in international business throughout the year. I am honored to give a special welcome to our guests and to our center's academic director, Dr. Kisleya Prasad, who will take us into a discussion after I finish a few more opening comments. Please let me share a few tips to help us move smoothly through the next hour. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded. It will be made publicly available via the school's website and emailed out to all participants afterwards for future viewing. For optimal viewing, please select the grid view in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Additionally, you can click on View in the toolbar in the upper left-hand corner, and then click on Hide Non-Video Participants. Following the discussion, we will open up the conversation for questions from the audience. Throughout the discussion, please feel free to send your questions to the host in the chat function, and we'll try to get through as many as we can in the order they are received at the end of the discussion. Once the event closes, you'll see a pop-up window with a link to take our 2-minute survey about the event. We appreciate you taking the time to complete that, as your feedback is critical to the development of future virtual events. Please also be reminded to keep your cameras off and your microphones on mute throughout the event. And finally, if there are any other technical difficulties on our end or yours, we thank you in advance for your patience. Before I introduce our speakers, I invite you to join our next Distinguished Speakers event on Monday, February 8th, as we discuss the 5 significant trends that will dramatically shape the global outlook and operating environment over the next 5 years. Please also continue to engage with us on Twitter at Smith Global Biz for up-to-date information. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speakers. We do regret that Emmanuel Gan of the WTO, originally scheduled to join us on the panel, will not be able to join us this afternoon. We have Dr. Javier Lopez Gonzalez, a senior trade economist at the Trade and Agriculture Directorate of the OECD. His recent work is focused on measurement and analysis of digital trade, cross-border data regulation, and exploring what market openness means in the 21st century. He has previously worked on the drivers and implications of participation in global value chains, global patterns of supply chain trade, and how SMEs can make the most out of global value chain participation. Javier holds a PhD in economics from the University of Sussex. Dr. Bill Reinsch, also joining us this afternoon, holds the Scholl Chair in International Business at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and is a senior advisor at Kelly, Dry, and Warren LLP. Previously, he served for 15 years as president of the National Foreign Trade Council and as a member of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. He is also an adjunct assistant professor here at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy, teaching courses in globalization, trade policy, and politics. He holds degrees from the Johns Hopkins University. I'd like to now turn the event over to our moderator for the panel this afternoon, Dr. Kisleya Prasad, Academic Director of the Center and Research Professor of Decisions Operations and Information Technology here at the Smith School of Business. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Thanks, Marina, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome. Happy New Year as well. Let me begin by first welcoming our very distinguished panelists to the University of Maryland. It's an honor to have you both here, so thank you so much. I only wish we could have been in Van Munching Hall, but that's the way things are. So we have a lot of ground to cover. So I'll keep my preamble fairly short, but I do want to give everyone a quick outline of what the discussion is going to be about. So as you notice, the topic of the day today is global trade in the new year. And this year has gotten off to a difficult start. It's not even the middle of January, and we've seen a violent insurrection in the Capitol and the impeachment of President Trump. However, in a few days, Joe Biden will be sworn in as the 46th President of the United States. And one of the topics that we'll discuss today is what it will mean for global trade and trade policy. Of course, we do live in the shadows of the global pandemic, and that's going to hold the world's attention for some time. On the positive side, effective vaccines are now available, though we still have the daunting challenge of getting it out to the world's population. We already had two center events on what the impact of COVID-19 has been on different parts of the globe and on the trade between them. So we want to revisit that ground. But we want to talk more about what some of the lasting changes of COVID will be. And one of the things that's accelerated has been digital trade and global data flows. So that'll be a big topic of discussion for us. A third topic, and this came in as a request from some of the people who registered, was that we talk about Brexit. So we'll definitely try and get to that, what it means for the UK and for EU, but also what it means for us here in the US. Then on vaccines, I don't know how much time we'll have, but one of the things, if possible, I might, or one of our panelists might say something about trade rules with respect to vaccines. India and South Africa have put in a request for waivers for intellectual property protection when it comes to vaccines and medications for COVID, and we can talk a little bit about the state for that. But definitely, we'll preserve time for audience questions. So do get questions out to us, and I will put as many as I can to the panelists. Okay, so with that, I'll move on to the questioning. And once again, thank you for joining us. So I'll pose my first question to Javier, if I may. Javier, as we look forward to 2021, what do you think are going to be some of the new issues that will be arising, or what are some of the big issues that will be holding our attention over the coming year?
So first of all, let me thank you for the kind introduction and the invitation. It's a real pleasure and honor to be in this panel amongst such distinguished panelists as well. I think, as you mentioned, these are uncertain times, and I think it's difficult for us to predict what issues might arise throughout the year. I mean, if we were doing this exercise last year, we would have got everything completely wrong. And as you said, much will depend on how COVID-19 evolves and also how rapidly we can deploy the vaccines across the globe. In terms of sort of the policy debate, I think there's three issues that will grow in prominence over the year. The first one is global value chains and whether these have adequately allowed us to access the products needed to fight the existing crisis or forthcoming problems. And in this context, what we're seeing is that many are arguing that sort of the existing flexibilities in global value chains have enabled us to react quickly to these unprecedented changes in demand. But there are others that are calling for more reshoring and more strategic production. The EU is referring to strategic autonomy, and it's not a very well-defined term, but discussions here are going to continue to intensify throughout the year. I think the second element of debate is going to be discussions on what I like to call trade and issues. And these are discussions on trade and, let's say, international competition, so industrial subsidies. We like to call this at the OECD leveling the playing field, but also trade and the environment, with a very strong environment agenda that we're hearing in the EU with discussions on border carbon adjustment. The other trade and topic is the one that's very dear to me, as you mentioned, which is basically trade and digitalization. And I think this includes sort of the rules of digital trade, but also things that are a bit external to the trade world, in that it's things such as taxation, it's things such as international competition in digital markets, privacy, national security, and those things are going to come more and more into those international discussions. And the last element is sort of the obvious one that we've been discussing for a very, very long time, but what is the governance of international trade going to look like? We've got WTO reform with a new DG coming in. What are the rules going to look like? Do they need to be updated? Do we need to update different types of processes? There's also movement in regional trade agreements. Clearly, discussions on expansions of CPTPP. There's the RCEP that is coming in. So bilaterally and in terms of regional trade agreements, there's going to be growing discussions there. And lastly, something that you mentioned is sort of the domestic trade policy environment. The EU is sort of changing. There's a new trade commissioner, or recently appointed trade commissioner, and there's a lot of movement happening there. And of course, the new US administration and what's happening in China. So those are, I think, the main debates that are going to shape discussions in the next year.
You're on mute, Kesaia.
So a very complex and dynamic set of issues. So I think it should make for an exciting year. Bill, I'm going to ask you about the U.S. administration, but did you want to say anything in general before on what the next year might look like before that?
No, not specifically. I think some of my comments will build on what Javier said, but let's just go ahead and do it that way.
Perfect. Then, so then let's start with the U.S. administration in Washington, D.C. That is what grabs our attention the most right now. Bill, to you, what will a change in the U.S. administration mean for U.S. trade policy? And I'm also curious in this context of, do you think Mr. Trump will have a lasting effect, if any, and in what are the ways in which the Biden era will evolve, and how might it be different?
Well, I think Trump certainly changed the conversation and forced everybody to focus on questions that probably need to be focused on, but didn't do it in a way that turned out to be very effective. I think that historians will say that, at least as far as both the administration before him and the one that comes after him, it's a case of right diagnosis, wrong prescription. He identified a number of legitimate, serious problems that need to be dealt with. His approach to dealing with them, I think, was counterproductive and is borne out by the lack of result. So he's refocused attention in a lot of places, not just the United States, but we're still wrestling with what the proper means of dealing with the problems are. And I think you'll see that reflected in the Biden administration's approach. First, I think there are sort of two mantras that are appropriate. One is domestic policy first, and the second is no sudden moves. The incoming president's been clear that he wants to devote his initial energy to the pandemic and to restructuring and rebuilding the economy, which I think most Americans would say are the most important priorities. But related to that has been his view that we can't successfully take on China in particular unless and until we are stronger ourselves, and until we've done a better job of pushing our innovation capabilities to a higher level than they have been in recent years. So if you look at his Build Back Better program, a lot of that is devoted to returning the U.S. to the number one innovating country. I think he's following a prescription that those of you that are listening, some of you I see are former students, so I don't think all of this will be repetitious, but this one thing will be, if you're in a race, as we are, there's only two ways to win. One is to run faster, and the other one is to trip the other guy. And in the world of national competition, they're probably both appropriate strategies, but the real way to win is to run faster. And Biden is very much focused on that. We need to out-innovate the competition, because at the end of the day, the issue is not really how do we compete with China in China, or even how do we compete with China in the United States. It's how do we compete with China everywhere else, in India, in Africa, in Europe, in Latin America, where the playing field is more level, and we simply have to be better prepared to do that. And I think a lot of his, they may be called trade policies, but they'll really be focused on making our innovation and actually manufacturing base stronger than it has been. I think the other thing you'll see, as I said, is no sudden moves. He inherits a whole boatload of problems: China tariffs, steel tariffs, aluminum tariffs, unfinished negotiations with the UK, with Kenya, actually with Japan. There's a lot of the Airbus-Boeing dispute, the digital services tax dispute. There's a whole bunch of stuff out there that can't really be postponed. You'll have to make some decisions. I think you're not going to see sudden rollbacks of everything that Trump has done. Those are everything I said are policies that will be reviewed, and I think as it becomes timely, they'll act on them. And I think in some cases, people that are expecting all the things they don't like to go away on January 21st are going to be disappointed. They're not all going to go away. But as I said, same diagnosis, different prescription. He's going to conduct himself differently. He is a confirmed multilateralist, in contrast to Trump, who was an equally confirmed unilateralist. He believes in building coalitions. He believes in teamwork. And I think you'll see his two highest priorities are developing a coalition to address the issues that we all share with China, but to do it in a collective way rather than individually. And second, I think he's going to spend a lot of his energy rebuilding the relationship with Europe, which has suffered a whole series of blows for the last 4 years, and not just in the trade area. Probably his first move will be to remind everybody of the importance of NATO and reaffirm the American commitment to NATO. And there's a host of other non-trade issues there as well, particularly with how to deal with Russia. But trade is an important one. The EU has handed out an olive branch. It's proposing, without using the word, a kind of a reset of the relationship. And we'll see where that leads. They've chosen to emphasize the things that we've done that make them unhappy, rather than things that they've done that make us unhappy. There's plenty of both. This has been going on for 40 years. We've been negotiating with them on some issues without result. But I think you're going to see a real effort to improve that relationship, to take the Europeans up on their offer. They've made clear they're not looking for a comprehensive trade agreement. TTIP is not ready to return. I don't think there's a lot of support for it on either side of the Atlantic. But they are interested in resolving a lot of these outstanding issues, including the ones I mentioned. And we have some on the table, too, that are our grievances. So there's an opportunity there for a robust negotiation. I think he'll take it. I think he'll continue the negotiations that are underway with the UK. I mean, why not? We'll see if it ends up successfully, but you don't want to basically slap the other country in the face by calling them off. So those will continue, hopefully to a conclusion. I think the question that comes up every time I participate in one of these is, what's he going to do about TPP? And I'll just close with this. I mean, there's a whole host of issues I could go on. Let's stop with TPP. There, I think the path is actually clear, although you won't see anybody saying that today. His security advisors will tell him, you need to return. Part of U.S. policy for 50 years has been to prevent the dominance of a single power in Asia. Initially, that was Japan, and now it's China. We can't do that without a presence there, and not just, you sending an aircraft carrier through the South China Sea once a month is not a sufficient presence. You have to be there, and you have to be there economically. So his security people are going to tell him, you need to get back into what is now CPTPP. His trade people will tell him, that's toxic politically, that's very difficult, don't waste your political capital on that. That's why he gets the big bucks, he gets to decide. There is a template, and it's a democratic template. Clinton used it with NAFTA, Obama used it with Korea, Speaker Pelosi used it with USMCA. You declare the existing agreement inadequate, you announce you'll fix it, you enter into a negotiation to do that, you produce a different product, you pronounce it improved, and then you join. And I think that's what we'll see. We're not going to see it right away. This is going to take at least two years, I think. Not only to even it'll take a year to take the first step, I think. But inevitably, that's where it leads us. I happen to think also public opinion has changed on this. The people that are dead set against it are still dead set against it. But I think a lot of people that are in the middle appreciate the mistake that Trump made by withdrawing TPP, and I think the bulk of public opinion is shifting on it. So eventually, I think we go back, but it's going to take a while. I think with that, I'll stop. I think some of the other issues, digital and climate, which will be a big Biden priority, are ones we can address a little bit later.
We can get to that. Just one quick clarification question before we move on, which is when you say that Trump's diagnosis was correct, I was wondering if you could elaborate just a little bit on what you mean by the diagnosis.
Well, it's most obvious in the case of China.
China, yeah.
Where if you look at the USTR report on Section 301, via Section 301, they identified essentially subsidies, favoritism towards state-owned enterprises, forced technology transfer, discrimination against foreign companies operating in China as sort of, as the Chinese would say, core issues that are problematic for us. Phase one of the Trump agreements dealt with effectively with virtually none of that. Mm-hmm. So saving it for the future. So, and I don't think you'll find any difference in the Biden diagnosis of the problem. Those are the issues. If you read Made in China 2025, or you read their 13th five-year plan, or what you will probably see in their 14th five-year plan when it comes out, is their goal is to create global champions in selected technologies, most of which are ones where the U.S. is the current leader. So what they're really saying is they want to take us on competitively. That's fine. I mean, it's our job to be prepared to compete. But to the extent they do it by breaking international trade rules, usually on subsidies, then we have recourse. We have some recourse. We ought to have more recourse. And that's what the negotiation will be about. I think beyond China, Trump articulated his policy. Basically, it was a policy of victimization and grievance. You know, the United States has been taken advantage of by the foreigners for 50 years, and it's all of his predecessors' fault because they didn't do anything about it. And he said he was going to fix it. Well, he hasn't fixed it, but and he ignores the fact that it wasn't like we were fools. We had, his predecessors felt that it was important for the United States to maintain a global trading system, and it was in the interests of our broader security interests in some situations to probably accept more imports than some people in the United States would have liked. Those are decisions president gets to make. They weren't mistakes. They were they were consequential policy decisions. Trump sort of characterized them as errors, but we are moving into an era, I think, where the United States is lost some of its enthusiasm for a global system where the developed countries end up paying the cost to sustain it. I mean, the Doha round failed, I think, essentially because you had the EU and the United States and other developed countries saying to the rapidly emerging countries, China and India, in particular South Africa and Brazil, you need to take on a greater share of the burden of maintaining the system. You need to open up more. You need to be a good example. And those countries said, no, we don't want to do that. We want to continue to receive the benefits and not pay the costs. And I think the exasperation about that Trump tacked tapped into is real. And I think you'll see that reflected in some of the Biden policies as well.
Okay. Thank you. Javier, I was going to ask you what the view from Europe was, but in view of the time, I'll sort of keep moving us along. And instead ask you, what are your thoughts on how the world trading system is evolving in light of technological change? And this is just a setup for further questions on digital trade and the digital economy. So.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to react very much to what Bill said. I kind of was nodding quite vigorously to a few things. I might disagree on a few others, but I think we're not expecting that many changes in terms of the issues, but maybe changes in the process, in the way that these issues are being dealt with. In terms of the thoughts on where it's evolving or where the system is evolving, I think it's always useful when you're thinking about digital trade, and me being an economist, to sort of think of where we were to understand where we're going in terms of how trade is evolving. And I always like to borrow from Richard Baldwin. He sort of presented globalization as taking place in different unbundling. And so his first unbundling is essentially the separation of production and consumption, which is, we're able to do that because there's very big reductions in transportation costs with the steam engine and things like that. And in sort of this relatively simple world where it's only trade costs that matter, we trade final goods. And the trade policy issues are relatively simple. We care about market access, we care about tariffs. Now, clearly we are now, or what he was arguing, Richard Baldwin was arguing, was that we are sort of at a second unbundling, or we were at a second unbundling, where rather than just unpacking production and consumption, it was the production itself that was being unpacked across different borders. And you're able to do this because of the continued reduction in transportation costs, but also very important reductions in coordination costs. And trade continues to be about final products, but it's about how you produce those final products. And you get a lot more trade in intermediate goods and intermediate manufacturing products. Now, when you're unpacking factories, you need the rules to be relatively similar. So the trade policy issues become even more complicated. And you need to think about trade, you need to think about investments, services, and knowledge, as well as things like trade facilitation, domestic behind the border, non-tariff measures. And so where we are now is essentially something that builds on those two unbundlings. And you might argue that we're in a third unbundling where we've unpacked not just the production in factory, but also the production in offices, the logistics as well, and also the consumption where we're consuming from different places. And this is sort of an age of hyperconnectivity. And what's driving this is that continued reduction in transportation costs and coordination costs. But really, really importantly, is the cost of sharing information. So data flows that underpin a lot of these things that are moving across borders. And essentially what we're seeing in this era is continued trade in final goods and continued trade in intermediate goods, but really importantly, a lot more fragmentation and a lot more trade in services. And trade in services is inherently much more complicated. But also we're seeing a lot more trade in digitally ordered parcels, those small things that you order from Amazon, in applications that are coming and that you're consuming through your phone, and talking about consumption through the phone, new types of products that combine the characteristics of goods and of services and that are constantly connected to the internet. And so what this means is that on top of caring about market access, about tariffs, about trade facilitation, about domestic behind the border measures, we now have to care about digital connectivity, interoperability, data flows, privacy, national security, digital competition, digital taxation, you name it. So everything has become much more complicated. Not only that, but also the trade of today, we expect it to be faster. So we expect it just in time and 24/7, and it has to meet all these different regulatory challenges, or these regulatory sort of criteria, especially in places such as the EU. And what this means really is that we need much more agile trade policy. And really, again, at the center of this is dealing with those trade and issues, and in particular, trade and digitalization and trade and cross-border data flow.
So I'm trying to think of an example of what you're talking about. So tell me if this is a good or a bad example, which might be telemedicine across the border. So if I try and get some specialized doctor's help from another country, that's all a digital exchange, and the data flows and the regulatory issues associated with that. Would that be a good example or a bad example?
So it would be a good example, but clearly that would be under a GATT. So if there's a liberalization in terms of sort of your GATT commitments or liberalization in terms of your FTA, that's the rule that would apply. On the data flow side, it becomes much more complicated because it falls a bit strangely because the data supports a service, but it might not actually be the service that is being delivered. So I think that in that sense, this is why we have very clear rules for goods, very clear rules for services, but data flows stand very awkwardly because data flows support manufacturing activities in global value chain, but they also support the delivery of service and a whole bunch of other things as well. And that's where it's very strange because we just don't know exactly how those data flows should be regulated.
Okay, great. So since you brought up regulation, so what is, following from your mention of cross-border data flows, what are the issues at stake and why is it important? If you think, I know you covered some of this already, so if you want to move on to COVID and data flows, we can do that.
I'd be happy to say a few things quickly on that. I mean, what we see now is that when you think of an international trade transaction today, it's really difficult to think of that trade transaction to take place without some form of cross-border data movement. And at the same time, a lot of domestic transactions have some cross-border data flow movement. So for example, when I access the OECD iLibrary, which is from the proposal of the OECD in Paris, I'm actually accessing a service that's hosted in the US, was a few years ago. And so sometimes you might think that something's domestic, but it's actually international. And so increasingly, these data flows are moving out there, and it's very difficult to determine where they are. But what we are seeing is that this pervasive exchange of data is fueling a lot of concerns that relate to the use and the misuse of data. And it's sort of amplifying concerns about privacy protection, about cybersecurity, about regulatory reach, competition, industrial policy, intellectual property rights, a whole bunch of stuff. And this is especially the case when the data moves jurisdiction. We have sort of an internet that is global, but we have all these regulations that work in specific regions, and that makes it really difficult to sort of square that circle. And so when we started mapping the regulatory environment that we did a couple of years ago, we saw that there was an increasing number of countries that were updating and adapting their regulation relating to cross-border data flow. So what they were doing is either restricting the movement of data for reasons related to privacy or national security, or mandating that data is stored or processed in specific locations. And now the problem with this is that what has emerged is a patchwork of different regulations which create uncertainties for government and for individuals, including with respect to what rules have to apply with what situation. I've been working on this for 4 or 5 years, and it's still very difficult to understand what rules in terms of cross-border data flows apply to what situation. Importantly as well, it's making it very difficult for firms, especially smaller ones, to operate across different markets. So it affects their ability to internationalize, so it increases trade costs, but also it affects their ability to where they wanted to protect the information of individuals because they don't know what rule they have to apply. So what this really means is that we need to find a way where we can ensure that data can flow between countries and between jurisdictions, but also meet this different policy requirements. And it turns out it's a very difficult thing, but it's really important because most of our trade relies on it.
So COVID has had a direct effect that we are already being able to see and measure on the digital economy and data flows and so on.
Yes, absolutely. So I mean, one of the things that's been really interesting with COVID is just how digital trade has enabled us to deal with some of the consequences. So digital trade hasn't necessarily helped us to fight the pandemic itself, but it's allowed us to deal with some of the consequences of lockdowns. So we did some analysis using sort of Google mobility data and saw that the unprecedented reduction in mobility in places of retail. So we were seeing goods come to us rather than us going to the shops. At the same time, we saw workplace mobility drop about 50% 1 month into the lockdown, which was really, really impressive. And we saw digital mobility increasing. That is, that there was increases in bandwidth of about 25% to even 50% in some OECD countries. So it's important to sort of highlight that one of the things that happened with the coronavirus is that it accelerated some trends that were already in the process of exploding. But we saw, for example, in terms of goods, increases in online purchases, which were up to 120% in some regions. And so really a big explosion. And so what we're expecting is to see a lot more of this. However, there is a problem. And that is that what we're seeing is that there are a lot of trade barriers that continue to be in place. And it becomes very difficult for us to take advantage of that when we have growing barriers. So, for example, the products that we use to access the internet, our mobile phones and our laptops, in many countries have barriers up to 10 to 12% tariff. And also digital services or digitally enabled services, telecommunication services, are also subject to a lot of different restrictions. So we're seeing an increasing push towards digitalization, but we're not seeing a corresponding liberalization of trade in goods and services that underpin those digital infrastructures.
Okay, thanks. Bill, if turning to you, what are your thoughts on digital trade, especially as it comes to trade policy and also within the US context?
Well, I largely am in agreement with Javier about what's happening. I think that COVID has accelerated a trend that was underway anyway. One of the questions that we're thinking about here is the extent to which things will go back to the way they used to be post-COVID, and I think the answer to that is probably not. That work from home or telework or the preference for home delivery rather than actually going out shopping is probably somewhere between long-term and permanent, and that's going to affect the makeup of the jobs market here and everywhere else. I mean, retail has taken a terrible hit. Travel and tourism has taken a terrible hit. That, I think, some of that will return. Think about it. The Grand Canyon is always an interesting place to be, and people are going to want to go there forever. But business travel, which is the big revenue raiser in that industry, has tanked, and it will probably stay tanked. If people start to think about it, if your options are paying a large sum of money for a business trip, a business class ticket to Tokyo for a meeting, or doing it on Zoom or WebEx, since that's what we're using here, that may only be 80% as good, but 80% may be good enough if the alternative is an expensive airline ticket, a hotel bill, and all the time that the downtime basically that you're involved in. So I don't see a lot of that returning, which means that the digital trend, the digitization trend, is going to continue. The problem I think we've got, and Javier alluded to it, is that you don't have a governance structure that is really equipped to deal with what's happening. You've got effectively competing systems. You've got a Chinese system, which is basically total control for a variety of purposes. You've got an EU system, which from the American point of view is heavily regulated and excessively focused, to my point of view anyway, on privacy. And the American problem is we don't really have a policy, and one of the problems, one of the things I learned in my time working on Capitol Hill was you can't beat something with nothing. And you can't be very effective at combating, if you want to, the Chinese approach or the EU approach if you don't have one of your own, and if you don't have a coherent policy of your own. And to compound the difficulty in the United States is the absence of a federal policy on privacy, for example, or policies on data governance has been the states are stepping in. They become sort of the default regulator. And that creates an enormous problem because if, over time, more and more of them do that, you're going to have 50 different regulatory bodies, not all having the same standards and the same rules. A nightmare for business. And it also becomes a nightmare for the federal government because it makes it much more difficult in the face of state actions to basically preempt all of them and say, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to have a national approach. Because you've created these built-in constituencies, particularly in California. So I think what's happening is that at least in the non-authoritarian world, what the EU is doing is becoming the default position. I'm not sure that's the best position. I also think we're about to discover, we'll see how it evolves, but if you look at the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Market Act that the EU has proposed, what you may, and the AI rule that is forthcoming, what you may see is some of their own rules tripping over each other. How do you reconcile artificial intelligence regulation, which depends on massive transfers of data, with EU privacy rules, which depends on blocking transfers of data? I mean, this is for the Europeans to sort out, but it's a problem that we all face in the at a 40,000 foot level. This is a global commons problem, like China, like climate change, that is optimally best dealt with through some sort of international agreement. But we are far, far away from that. We've had 4 years of zero American leadership on that front. I think under Biden, this is clearly an issue they're seized with. I can tell you that with some confidence. Not that they have answers, but they have clearly identified it as something important that they want to focus on. So we'll see how it develops.
Yeah, so it was actually interesting to me that when I think back to 2020, how much regulation of big tech, how big a role it played all over the world. So even here in the United States, Margaret Vestager has become not quite a household name, but well known enough. So maybe Javier, I'll turn to you and talk about. I think Bill already started the conversation on what I wanted to get to next, which is tech firms and the digital economy. They both figured prominently in the news, and the EU shows some resolve towards regulating big tech. And there was a congressional paper here which does move in the same direction. So could you talk about this push towards greater regulation of big tech firms?
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to sort of draw or defer on some things that were being said about privacy and in particular GDPR in the EU. I think that the issue between these three competing models, the China, EU, and US model, I think I agree that sort of the China model is something that is going to be very difficult to bridge. That is a model where there's sort of complete oversight of any data flows that are being transferred, and it's not clear whether it's just private information, it's important information. But between the EU and the US, there are already systems to transfer data and instruments that can be used. For example, there's the Privacy Shield, which recently was overturned, but in the absence of Privacy Shield, there are standard contractual clauses or binding corporate rules, and they're in the process of doing sort of Privacy Shield Mach 2 or whatever they will call that next one. I think the real problem here in terms of governance of data flows is that the big ones will muddle through. There will always be an agreement between the EU and the US, and when it goes down, there will be another one, and there might be one between the EU and Japan and so forth. We need something global. As I said, the internet is global and it involves everyone. And so in that sense, the work that we're doing at the OECD is trying to push a bit more for understanding the need for sort of global digital governance. And the way that you do this is sort of through a mix of trade and other types of agreements. So for example, the OECD has the OECD privacy guidelines that can serve as useful inputs for sort of agreements on cross-border data flows. It's clear that the US, in terms of cross-border data flows, likes to go or prefers to go the trade agreement side. So, USMCA and other types of agreements, they will have a data flow provision. CPTPP has other ones as well. The EU, on the other side, likes to go through another process that's not directly trade-related, through things such as Convention 108. So there are different instruments out there that will enable this to happen, but it is increasingly clear with respect to sort of digital policy that there are a lot of differences in the approach, as sort of Bill mentioned. But I believe that trade is about managing exchange in the context of these existing differences. There's been differences on a whole bunch of stuff in agriculture, and somehow we've managed to muddle through some of those things. So for me, one of the things that is important to keep in mind is to try and leverage trade policy so that we can bridge those differences. And let me say a few quick things. One of the things that worries me a bit in terms of the discussion is how, I'm a trade economist, but a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about recently is about sort of the Digital Markets Act, which is sort of something about gatekeepers and competition, or Digital Services Act, which is about illegal content. I feel a bit more uncomfortable about that, but we need to be increasingly wary that these things have very important trade consequences. And the way that I see this as well is that we can apply some of the really useful principles of international trade policy into these areas. So make sure that the Digital Markets Act is one that is transparent, that has interoperability by default, or that ensures that approaches are sort of least trade restrictive. And so I think these things are sort of useful to think about.
Yeah, so this is such a complex topic that I could keep asking both of you questions for a long time to just get the thing clear, but we clearly don't have time for that. And it being 1:15, I think we should move to audience questions. There were several, I think a good number of the questions that were submitted already with the registration dealt with Brexit. So I will summarize some of them in one question on Brexit, which I'll open it up for either or both of you to take, and then I will put other questions as they come in. So the Brexit question was, a number of registrants asked, which is, well, what will the Brexit deal mean for the United States, for the UK, for EU, and what is to be expected in the future with Brexit? So several people were interested in that.
Andrew, you want to go first? Or you want me to? Okay. Well, I begin. I think the consequences are different in different places. The larger decision, if you want an opinion, the decision to leave. I mean, the basic Brexit decision, I think, from the UK standpoint, is going to go down as an historic mistake for them. You know, they're going to transition from an important and influential part of a very, very large and important trading bloc to becoming essentially a middle-sized power that 30 years from now will make them irrelevant. But we'll see. I won't be around in 30 years in all probability to find out. I think they've just embarked on a difficult path. The deal that they struck with the EU has been, I think, correctly characterized as thin. It doesn't address a lot of the issues, including most of the ones we've been talking about, because it doesn't really address services, it doesn't address digital issues. And the UK's will say, well, it leaves us with options to deviate. And I think that, the UK is the country that is in the most difficult position on this, because in their negotiation with us, we are going to press them to adopt the US regulatory approach on numerous issues. And the EU is going to insist that if they want unfettered access, across the channel, they have to continue to maintain their fealty to EU regulations. And those two positions are incompatible. And both sides are effectively telling the UK, you have to choose. Now, in a perfect world, there's an answer to that, which is the US and the EU reach some kind of giant harmonization agreement and make the differences irrelevant. That's not going to happen. It's certainly not going to happen anytime soon. So the UK is in the awkward position of having to decide, what are they going to do on GMOs? I mean, to me, I make jokes about it, but I did it in my class, but the symbolic case here is chickens. We're going to tell them, you have to take our chickens. And the EU is going to say, if you take their chickens, you're not going to be able to sell your chickens in Europe. And so the UK is in a difficult position to try to decide how it wants to proceed. The bulk of its trade as an entity is with the EU, nearly half. We may be the single largest one-country trading partner, but clearly they're linked to the continent. I think in the end that's going to make it much more difficult than they think to reach an agreement with us. We'll see if Biden how Biden moves the goalposts in terms of U.S. objectives. But my information about the state of the talks has been that they've made a lot of progress on the easy stuff, but virtually none on the difficult issues, which are kinds of things I'm talking about. And I don't think the Brexit agreement provides some clarity, at least, and some areas where the UK can say, we clearly have flexibility to do something different. And the answer is, yes, you do. But I think the French or German answer is, yeah, okay, But if you exercise that flexibility, there may be consequences here. And you have to take that into account. So I'm not sure it solved that much.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure that it makes the negotiation with us much easier. But in the end, the burden really is going to be on the British to decide which way they want to lean. Javier, do you disagree with that?
No, not at all. I mean, I think anyone would have struggled to put it as eloquently as you just put it. I think that's a very good sort of view. I mean, from my side, I'm not going to say too much more. I haven't read the agreement, but I think it's useful to give an illustration of that challenge that you're just saying is, you know, the GDPR discussion right now and the data flow discussion. So we spoke about the US system, we spoke about the EU system, and the UK now has to make that choice. Do we maintain the system that we have that is GDPR compliant and adequacy and go with the EU, or do we actually go the way that the US has gone? One negates the other one. You know, so if you go the US way, then you won't have that market access in the EU and the other way around. So it's a really, really difficult situation to solve at the moment. One of the things that I do think of that there might be some, and I'm trying to find a positive in all of this, is that a lot of this is gravity. And what I mean by gravity is that international trade suggests that you trade more with your close neighbors. And largely that's driven because of goods and because of transport costs. One of the questions that someone might ask is, in a world of digital delivery where distance might matter a bit less, you know, will the impact be okay if I go another way because I'll still be able to trade more with the US, which is perhaps more of a tech giant than the EU? So these are sort of some of the things that the UK has to choose. But I agree with Bill. This is an extremely difficult choice that has to be made, and it will have very important economic consequences.
So we have another question in the chat, which is Sergio Martinez. As the world recovers from COVID-19 and the ongoing economic recessions, what should the role of trade policy and international cooperation in enhancing the resiliency to future shock be? So would either of you like to take that? I guess there are two parts to it, but the main concern seems to be future shocks. Yeah.
So if you don't mind, I'll start with this one. I mean, look, we've done a bit of analysis in this area, and one of the things that we've seen is that no single country can produce all the goods that it needs to sort of fight the COVID-19 virus, the lockdowns and the issues. At the same time, no country can produce all the products that are needed to develop the vaccines. So for me, in a way, trade plays the role of allowing countries to access all these products that are really pivotal, not just in terms of fighting the vaccine directly, but as I said earlier, in terms of dealing with the consequences of the lockdown, accessing the computers, the mobile phones, which are producing complex global value chains. So for me, it's important to maintain markets open and to ensure that value chains continue to operate as they have been, because that is how we attain resilience. I worry that people have, or some have, this sort of thought that we can shut off trade and increase resilience. And what you'll find is that you might not be able to increase resilience because you'll find yourself without the capacity to produce the products that you need, particularly when having to meet very big increases in demand.
I'd say I think that's right. I just add, there's a cycle to these things when there's a giant event like this. The first, well, it's human nature. The first thing that happens is panic. And what panic means in this case is let's hoard. Let's make sure that we produce everything we need and let's keep it. And that's always a mistake because, first of all, autarky is not really viable in a modern economy. You can't produce everything that you need, and it makes no sense, therefore, to simply try to, hoard it and keep it away from everybody else. It's mutual impoverishment. Fortunately, usually countries work through the panic, and then they erect barriers, and then they begin to take them away as the situation stabilizes. Even though it hasn't gone away, people understand how to cope with it. That's sort of happening. But you still see echoes of it in terms of export restrictions and inexplicably tariffs on imports of health-related equipment that ought to be coming in duty-free, which makes no sense at all. Blame that one on the Indians, actually, in terms of discussions about it. But I think, if you look at the cycle, it's sort of like this. We're getting back to normal, or what passes for normal, but we're not there yet. But it takes leadership. It takes, governments saying, no, we're not going to do that. That sounds like a good idea in the short run, but it'll make things worse for everybody over time, and we're going to avoid that. And that takes some courage, because it's not the politically popular position.
The next question from Katerina Slobodova. This is for you, Bill. She asks, you mentioned that the Biden administration will likely have a focus on how to out-innovate China. What policies might we expect to see that support this type of approach?
More support for fundamental research, more federal support for fundamental and basic research. More public-private partnerships. If you look at Sematech, these are historical things, but if you go back ways, basically more partnership between government and companies. If you look at it historically, America is actually quite good at this. For 150 years, believe it or not, since the Lincoln administration, believe it or not, we've been quite good at identifying national goals and then committing government resources to produce, to achieve those goals. In the Lincoln and 19th century case, it was the Homestead Act and a number of other things that really created one of the world's most competitive agricultural sectors in the world, which at that time was important. We did it with wireless communication. After World War I, we did it with aerospace. We know how to do this. It's not always in fashion. Conservatives call it industrial policy. They call it picking winners and losers. They call it lots of things. It isn't exactly those things, but you're going to see more of it. You're going to see more federal programs. First of all, devoting more federal resources to the front end. Fundamental research, basic research, leaving it to the companies to invent, design, bring new things to market, but with federal encouragement. And what I hope you'll also see is government addressing more proactively the regulatory issues that we were just talking about that allow that kind of innovative environment to thrive.
Okay, and this one will have to be the last question. So this one is directed at you, Javier. What would it take to apply principles of international trade policy in a multilateral framework on digital governance? What would be the best fora to carry this out or to discuss this?
I see the easy question, huh? Look, this can happen at different levels. And in all fairness, there's a lot of ongoing regulation in this area. So what we're seeing is increasing digital provisions in trade agreements. We're also seeing new types of trade arrangements that are emerging, such as the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement between New Zealand, Singapore, and Chile. And we're also seeing, of course, the discussions of the WTO at the Joint Statement Initiative, which are touching on a lot of issues that we've discussed. And we've actually surprisingly not mentioned the Joint Statement Initiative enough in our discussion today. But it's very important. And as I said, the internet is global. And so what we really need to be able to benefit from what the internet and from what digital trade is able to offer us is an agreement that is completely multilateral. Now, the reason that I doubt of what is the best place to have it, it's clear that it's at the WTO, it's clear that it's multilateral, but clearly the more multilateral you go, the more difficult it is to have a deeper agreement. So there's value in sort of having the process, maybe a variable geometry in terms of what can be agreed in a plurilateral within the context of the WTO that can be complemented with different initiatives, be it through trade agreements, and as I said earlier as well, through other plurilateral arrangements for very specific issues. We see clearly there's taxation discussions taking place at the OECD, and there's other areas where we might find other parts of governance of the digital economy.
Well, thank you. I think we're just about out of time. So this has been really enlightening. I've enjoyed it a lot. It's very kind of both of you to come and share your insights. So thank you very, very much. Now, of course, we generally have some gifts for speakers, but we haven't adapted and developed digital gifts for people yet. But at some point we will get these out to you. Thank you so much again for being here.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure. Take care.
Bye-bye.